Hello everyone, I am Parashuram and today I am going to present the topic poverty in India. Let's beginning with the meaning of poverty. Poverty basically means a condition where a person is unable to maintain a minimum standard of living. In simple words, अगर किसी इंडिविजुअल के पास फूड क्लोथिंग शेल्टर एजुकेशन एंड हेल्थ केयर जैसे बेसिक नीड्स को फुलफिल करने के लिए सफिशिएंट रिसोर्सेस नहीं है then that person is considered poor. However, poverty is not just about low income. आज के मॉडर्न इकोनॉमी में poverty को मल्टी डायमेंशनल कॉन्सेप्ट माना जाता है. इसका मतलब है कि poverty सिर्फ पैसे की कमी नहीं बल्कि अपॉर्चुनिटीज, एजुकेशन, हेल्थ केयर, क्लीन ड्रिंकिंग वाटर और बेटर लिविंग कंडीशंस की कमी भी है. Now let's look at the concept of poverty. The slide shows that poverty includes inadequate income and consumption, lack of access to the basic services, poor quality of life and social exclusion. अगर किसी की पर्सन के पास इनकम को लेकिन एजुकेशन या हेल्थ केयर फैसिलिटीज़ अवेलेबल ना हो तो उसकी ओवरऑल क्वालिटी ऑफ लाइफ अफेक्ट होती है. नाउ लेट्स डिस्कस द टाइप्स ऑफ पोवर्टी. द फर्स्ट टाइप इज absolute poverty. This refers to a situation where a person's income or a consumption is below the minimum level required to meet basic needs. For example, if a family cannot afford adequate food and shelter, it falls under absolute poverty. The second type is relative poverty. When poverty सोसाइटी के कंपैरिजन पर बेस्ड होती है. Even if a person able to survive, his income may be such lower than the average income of a society. The type is a situational poverty. This occurs because of a sudden events such as unemployment, illness, accidents, droughts, or natural disasters. In such cases, poverty may be temporary. The fourth type is generational poverty. जब poverty एक जनरेशन के नेक्स्ट जनरेशन तक ट्रांसफ़र होती है उसे जनरेशनल पोवर्टी कहते हैं. लैक ऑफ एजुकेशनल एसेट्स एंड अपॉर्चुनिटीज ऑफन फैमिलीज trapped in the same cycle for many years. So the key takeaway from this slide is that poverty is much more than a lack of money. It affects opportunities, capabilities, dignity, and overall human development. Therefore, reducing poverty is essential for inclusive and sustainable development. Next slide. Now we understood the meaning and types of the poverty. Let's move on to the cause and consequences of the poverty in India. The first cause is the high population growth. When the population increases rapidly, the demand for food, housing, education, healthcare, and employment also increases. However, if economic growth and job creation do not keep pace with the population growth, many people struggle to meet their basic needs. This creates pressure on available resources and contributes to poverty. The second case is unemployment and underdevelopment. Many people in India do not have access to the regular and productive employment, especially in rural areas. Seasonal unemployment is very common. For example, farmers may get work only during sowing and harvesting seasons. During the remaining months, they often have a limited income opportunities. The third cause is low educational and skills. Education is one of the most important tool for improving standards, living standards. If people do not receive proper education or skill training, they find it difficult to secure well paying jobs. As a result, they remain trapped in the low income occupation. Next factor is inequality in income and wealth. Although India has experienced economic growth and benefits of the growth are not distributed equally, some sections of a society enjoy higher incomes and better opportunities, while others continue to struggle with the poverty. Another important cause is regional imbalance. Certain states and regions have a better infrastructure, industries, and employment opportunities. On the other hand, less developed regions often faces poverty due to the lack of investment and economic activities. The slide also mentions agriculture dependence and low productivity. The large portion of the population, India's population depends on agriculture for a livelihood. However, small land holdings, traditional farming methods, and unpredictable weathering conditions often results in a low agricultural productivity, and low income for farmers. Another major factor is the lack of access to healthcare, sanitation, and basic services. When people do not have access to the quality healthcare, cleaning, drinking water, and sanitation facilities, their quality of life deteriorates. Poor health can also reduce earning capacity and increase medical expenses. Finally, social factors such as the caste discrimination, gender inequality, and social inclusion also contributes to a poverty by limiting opportunities for a certain groups. Now let's look to the consequences of the poverty. The first consequences is the low standard of living. Poor families often struggle to afford the proper housing, nutrition, food, and essential service. Now that we have understood the meaning and types of poverty, okay, the now let us continue. The second consequences is the health problems. Poverty leads to malnutrition, diseases, and poor healthcare outcomes. Another consequences is the low educational attainment. Many children from poor households are unable to complete their education because of the financial difficulties. Poverty also contributes to the unemployment and low productivity. Without education or a skill, people find it difficult to obtain a productive employment. Finally, poverty increases social exclusion and inequality. Special exclusion and inequality. People living in a poverty may face discrimination and limited participation in economic and social activities. One important point to remember is the vicious cycle of the poverty. Poverty leads to the low education and poverty health. Low education results in a low productivity and low income. Low income again pushes back to the poverty. This cycle continues unless effective interventions are entered. So the key takeaway from this slide that the poverty from the both are the result and the cause of many economic and social challenges. Therefore, addressing poverty requires a comprehensive approach involving education, employment, generation, healthcare, and inclusive development. Next, after understanding the causes and the consequences of poverty, next important question is how poverty is actually measured. Right? We have the doubts how the poverty is actually measured. To measure poverty, economists and policymakers use the concept known as the poverty line. As shown in the slide, the poverty line is defined in the minimum level, the income or the consumption expenditure required to meet basic needs such as food, clothing, and shelter. In simple words, the poverty line acts as a benchmark. If a person's income or expenditure fall below this level, is considered a poor. If it is above the poverty line, the person is considered not classified as a poor. Now let's understand the poverty line in the Indian context. Historically, India used the calorie-based norms for determining poverty. The idea was that very individual requires the minimum amount of calorie for a healthy life. According to the slides in the calorie norms, the rural areas were 2400 calorie per person per day. For urban areas, 2100 calories per person per day. The rural requirement was higher because people in the rural areas generally performed more physical labor, especially in agriculture and related activities. The urban requirement was slightly lower because urban occupations usually involve less physical work. The estimation poverty in the government calculated the expenditure required to obtain these minimum calorie levels. Anyone spending these then less than this amount was considered below the poverty line. However, over time, economists realized that the poverty cannot be measured only through food consumption. People also need education, healthcare, transportation, housing, and other essential services. Therefore, expenditure-based measures gradually become more important. Now, let's discuss the measures poverty mentioned in the slide. The first measure is in the head count ratio. This measure tells us the percentage of the population living below the poverty line. Right? For example, if out of the 100 people, 20 people are below the poverty line, then the head count ratio will be 20%. It is the simplest, most common used in the poverty indicators. The second measure is the poverty gap. While the head count ratio tells us how many people are poor. The poverty gap tells us how poor they are. In other words, it measures the distance between the income of the poor people and the poverty line. A large poverty gap indicates the deeper poverty. The third measure is the severity of the poverty. This measure gives more importance to those who are extremely poor. It helps policymakers understand not only the number of poor people but also the intensity of the poverty among them. One important point is to remember that the poverty measurement is very important for a policy formulation. The government uses poverty estimates to identify the beneficiaries and designs welfare programs such as food subsidies, employment schemes, social security initiatives. Without accurate poverty measurement, resources cannot be allocated effectively. Therefore, the poverty line served as an important tool for identifying economically vulnerable sections of the society and monitoring progress in poverty reduction. So the key takeaway from this slide is that the poverty line provides a minimum benchmark for the basic living requirements, while measures such as the head count ratio, poverty gap, and severity of the poverty help us understand the extent and intensity of the poverty in a country. After understanding the poverty line, the next step is to understand how poverty is actually estimated in the India. As shown in this slide, India has used the different methods to estimate the household consumption expenditure. These methods are known as URP, MRP, and MMRP. The main difference between these methods is the recall period, which means the time period for which people are asked to remember and report their expenditure. Let's start with the first method. The first method is the URP, which stands for Uniform Reference Call, used up to. Under this method, respondents are asked to recall all the consumption expenditure for the previous 30 days. For example, if the survey is conducted today, the household has to report how much it spent on food, clothing, education, healthcare, and other items during the last 30 days. This method was used for many years because it was simple and easy to implement. However, one limitation of URP was that people often found it difficult to accurately remember all expenses for the entire month. As a result, there could be errors in reporting. Now, let us move to the second period, modified mixed recall period, MMRP. In this method, different recall periods are used for different categories of expenditure. Frequently purchased items such as a food are recorded using 30-day recall period. Items that are purchased less frequently such as cloth, footwear, education, and durable goods are recorded using 365-day recall period. The idea behind MRP was to improve the accuracy of expenditure data because people can better remember major purchases made over a longer period. Because of this improvement, MRP generally provides the more realistic estimates of consumption and poverty. Now let's discuss the third method, which is MMRP, or a modified mixed recall period. This is more advanced version of the MRP. Under MMRP, different items are assigned different recall periods depending on their nature. Frequently purchased items are recorded for least last 7 days. Sometimes use a 30-day recall period. Less frequently purchased items continue to use a 365-day recall period. This approach helps capture households expenditure more accurately because it reduces memory related errors. As we move from URP to MRP and then to MMRP, the estimation process becomes more refined and realistic. That is why poverty estimates may differ depending on which method is used. The slide also highlights an important point. Improved estimation methods help policymakers understand the actual living conditions of the household more accurately. Accurate poverty estimates are extremely important because government welfare schemes, subsidizes, and development programs can often depend on these figures. If the poverty is underestimated, some needy families may not receive benefits. If poverty is overestimated, resources may not be distributed efficiently. Therefore, choosing the right estimation method is essential for effective policy making. To summarize, URP uses a uniform 30-day recall period. MRP uses both 30-day and 365-day recall period. MMRP uses 7-day, 30 days and 365-day recall periods depending on the type of expenditure. Among these methods, MMRP is generally considered more comprehensive and accurate because it captures household consumption patterns in greater detail. So the key takeaway from this slide is that poverty estimation method have evolved over time to improve the accuracy and reliability of poverty measurement in India. Next, multi-dimensions. So for next, poverty using income expenditure and poverty line estimates. However, an important question is this: can we say that a person is not a poor simply because he or she earns through the income? Can you answer it? Yes or no? Answer is no. The person may have income but still lacks access to a quality education, health care, sanitation, and proper housing. This is why economists started looking at a poverty from a broader perspective. To address this issue, the Multidimensional Poverty Index, commonly known as MPI, was introduced. As shown in the slide, MPI was developed by the United Nations Development Programme or UNDP along with the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiatives, also known as OPHI. Unlikely traditional poverty measures, MPI does not focus only on income. Instead, it examines multiple dimensions of depravity that affects people's lives. According to the slides, MPI is based on three major dimensions. The first dimension is health. Health is considered a basic requirement for human development. Under this dimension, indicators such as nutrition and child mortality are examined. If a family suffers from a malnutrition or a poor health condition, it indicates a deprivation in a health dimension. The second dimension is education. Education plays a crucial role in improving quality of the life and future opportunities. This dimension generally looks at years of a schooling and education attendance. अगर किसकी हाउस होल्ड के चिल्ड्रन स्कूल नहीं जा रहे हैं या अडल्ट लिमिटेड एजुकेशन रिसीव कर रहे हैं, then the household may be considered deprived the education. The other dimension is the standard of the living. This dimension focuses on the quality of the daily life. Indicators include access to the electricity, clean drinking water, sanitation facilities, housing conditions, cooking fuels, and ownership of a basic assets. For example, if a family lives in a poorly constructed house without electricity or a proper sanitation, it reflects deprivation in the standard of a living dimensions. Now let us understand why MPI is important. Traditional poverty measures tell us to who is poor based on income, but MPI tells us how people are poor, in which areas they are facing deprivation. This provides a much more complete picture of the poverty. For example, two families have a similar incomes. However, one family may have access to the education, healthcare, and sanitation, while the other may not. Income-based measures may threat both families similarly, but MPI can clearly identify the differences in their living conditions. This is why policymakers increasingly use MPI while designing welfare programs. MPI helps government identify specific areas where intervention is needed. For example, if a region shows a high deprivation in the education, the government can focus on improving schools and literacy programs. Similarly, if the health indicators are poor, healthcare infrastructure can be strengthened. India has also shown a significant improvement in reducing multidimensional poverty in recent years through various welfare schemes and development initiatives. Therefore, MPI is considered one of the most comprehensive tools for understanding poverty in modern economics. The key undertaking from this slide is the poverty is not about the lack of income, it is about the lack of health, education, and decent living conditions. The Multidimensional Poverty Index (MPI) helps us understand the measures all the aspects together and provides more realistic understanding of human deprivation. After understanding this multidimensional poverty, let's next look to the poverty elimination or estimation has involved India over time. Poverty estimation in India has gone through several damages as economic conditions change and new data become available. Experts continuously improve the methods used to measure poverty. As shown as this slide, the journey started with the early poverty studies and gradually moved towards the more scientific and comprehensive approach. As shown in this slide, the journey started from with early poverty studies and gradually moved towards the more scientific and comprehensive approach. In the initial years after independence, poverty was mainly associated with the ability to meet minimum food requirements. Economists believe that if the person healthy life, food is enough, maintain a healthy life, then that a person should be considered poor. Because of this, early poverty estimates were largely based on a calorie consumption. The first major step came in the 1960s and 1970s when the research began linking poverty with the minimum consumption expenditure required to achieve specific calorie norms. This approach helped the policymakers identify people who were unable to meet basic nutritional requirements. However, over time, it became clear that poverty was not about only the food. People also needed education, healthcare, transportation, housing, and other essential services. As a result, experts started developing a more comprehensive method of poverty estimation. This slide highlights the important committees that contributed to the evolution. One of the earliest contributions came from the YK Alag task force. This task force first focused on the defining poverty lines using calorie norms and consumption expenditure. Later, the D.T. Lakadwala committee improved the methodology and recommended state-specific poverty lines because living costs differed across states. As India developed further, new challenges emerged. People spending patterns changed, urbanization increased, and expenditure on the education and healthcare became much more important. To address these changes, the Suresh Tendulkar Committee was formed. The Tendulkar Committee shifted the focus away from purely calorie-based poverty measurements and introduced the broader expenditure approach. This was considered a major reform in the poverty estimation. After that, C. Rangarajan Committee was established to further review and improve poverty measures. The committee suggested revised poverty lines and included a wide range of consumption requirements. One important trend that we can observe from the historical evolution is the shift from calorie-based measures to comprehensive expenditure-based measures. Initially, the focus was mainly on the food consumption. Later, policymakers realized that the recent standard of the living requires much more than the food alone. Today, poverty estimation considers various aspects of a human well-being, including health care, education, and living conditions. This evolution reflects the changing understanding of poverty in India. As the economy grows and society develops, the methods also use the measures. Poverty must also evolve to remain relevant and accurate. The government relies on these estimates for designing welfare programs, allocating resources, and monitoring. So the key takeaway from this slide is the poverty estimates in the India evolved from simple calorie-based approaches to the more comprehensive and realistic methods that better reflects the actual living conditions of the people. Next, the first one of this is YK Alag Task Force. Okay, the task force was constituted in 1979-77 by the Planning Commission to develop the more systematic method for the estimating poverty in India. Before this, there was no universally accepted poverty line for the entire country. YK Alag Task Force recommended that the poverty should be measured on the basis of the calorie requirement. According to these recommendations, that the poverty line should be correspond to a minimum calorie intake of the 2,400 calories per person per day in rural areas and 2,100 calories per person per day in urban areas. The logic behind this recommendation was quite simple. People need a minimum amount of food energy in living healthy and productive life. If their income or expenditure was not sufficient to achieve this calorie norm, they were considered poor. The task force then calculated the expenditure required to obtain these calorie levels and use that expenditure as the poverty line. One of the major contributions of the YK Alag task force was that it provided a clear and structured framework for poverty estimation in India. However, over time, some limitations become visible. The approach focused mainly on food consumption and calorie intake, while the other essential needs such as education, healthcare, transportation received or less attention. To address these issues, another important committee was formed. This committee was the DT Lakadwala Committee. The Lakadwala Committee further refined the poverty estimation methods and became the highly influential in the India's poverty measurement process. One of its key recommendations was the use of a state-specific poverty line. This was the important because the cost living varies from state to state. For example, the expenditure requirement from the third standard of the living in the metropolitan cities may be very different from that required in the rural district. Therefore, using a single poverty line for the entire country could produce inaccurate results. The Lakadwala committee also continued to use calorie based norms but improved the methodology for updating a poverty lines over time. It relied on consumer pricing indices to adjust poverty lines for inflation. This ensured that the poverty estimates remain relevant even when prices increase. The committee used data collected by the National Sample Survey Organization NSSO, commonly known as NSSO, to estimate poverty levels. For example, many years poverty estimates in India were based on a recommendation of the Lakadwala committee. However, as the India's economy developed and spending pattern changed, experts felt that the poverty measurement should include more than just calories requirement. People were spending more on healthcare, education, and other essential services. This led to the formation of the NIR committees such as Tendulkar Committee of the Rangarajan Committee. To summarize, YK electors were forces laid the foundation of the poverty estimated through calorie-based poverty lines, while the DT Lakadwala Committee improved the methodology by introducing the state-specific poverty lines and better price adjustment. Both committees played a crucial role in shaping India's poverty measurement framework and provided the fundamental future reforms in the poverty estimation. Now let's discuss one of the most important committees in the history of the poverty estimation in India, the Suresh Tendulkar Committee. The government of the India appointed this committee in 2005 under the chairmanship of Dr. Suresh Tendulkar. The main objective of this committee was to revive the existing poverty estimation methodology and suggest a more realistic approach. As we discussed in the previous slides, the Lakadwala committee mainly relied on the calorie-based poverty estimation. However, by the early 2000, experts realized that the people's spending patterns has changed significantly. Families were spending more money on education, healthcare, transportation, and other essential services. Therefore, measuring poverty only through the calorie intake was no longer sufficient. The Tendulkar Committee introduced a major shift in a poverty estimation. One of its most important recommendations was moving away from the strict calorie-based approach. Instead of focusing primarily on the calorie norms, the committee emphasized actual consumption expenditure patterns of the households. This was a significant changes because poverty was not revived in the broader context. The committee recognized that the educational and healthcare expenses are essential parts of households' expenditure and should be considered while estimating poverty. Another important recommendation was the adaptation of the uniform poverty line basket across rural and the urban areas. Earlier methodologies used separate approaches for rural and urban populations. The Tendulkar committee attempted to make poverty estimations more consistent and comparable. The committee also recommended the use of the mixed recall period or MRP data collected by the National Sample Survey Organization. As we learned earlier, MRP provides more accurate expenditure estimates because it uses different recall periods for different categories of expenditure. One of the most discussed outcomes of the Tendulkar committee was that revised poverty estimates for India. Using this methodology, the committee estimated that the significant proportion of the India's population was living below the poverty line. Although the exact figure generated public debate. The committee's methodology was considered more realistic than the previous approach. The recommendations of the Tendulkar committee become the more official for the poverty estimations in India for several years. Its methodology was widely used for policy making, welfare program, targeting and developing development plan. However, despite its contributions, the committee also received criticism. Some economists argued that the poverty estimates were still too low and did not adequately reflect the actual cost of living. According to critics, people classified as the above the poverty line could still struggle to meet basic needs. These concerns eventually led to the formation of the another expert known as the C. Rangarajan Committee. Even with this criticism, the Tendulkar Committee remains landmark in India poverty estimation history. It expanded the understanding of the poverty beyond the calorie intake and brought attention to the broader consumption needs such as education and healthcare. So the key takeaway from this slide is that the Suresh Tendulkar Committee introduced a more comprehensive expenditure based on approach to poverty estimates the marked major shift away from traditional calorie based methods. Its recommendation significantly improved poverty measurement and public policy in India. As per the constitution, after discussing Tendulkar committee, let's now move to the C. Rangarajan committee, which was formed to re-examine poverty estimation in India. The Rangarajan committee was constituted in 2012 under the chairmanship of Dr. C. Rangarajan, who was the former governor of the Reserve Bank of India. The main reason for setting up of this committee was the criticism surrounding the poverty estimation generated by the Tendulkar committee. Many economists and policymakers felt that the Tendulkar poverty line was too low and did not adequately represent the actual cost of living in India. Therefore, the government wanted a fresh review of the methodology. The Rangarajan committee carefully studied the household consumption patterns and proposed the new method for estimation poverty. One of the most important recommendations of the committee was that the use of broader consumption basket. Unlike earlier approaches that focused heavily on food expenditure, the Rangarajan committee includes both food and non-food requirements in a more comprehensive manner. The committee recognized that the people need much more than food, living a decent life. Expenses related to education, healthcare, transport, clothing, rent, and other essential services also need to be considered while estimating poverty. As shown in the slide, the committee revised the poverty line upward. This means that the minimum expenditure required to be considered above the poverty line was increased. According to the Rangarajan committee, the poverty line should reflect a more than a basic survival needs. Because of this revised methodology, the number of people classified as poor increased compared to Tendulkar estimates. This happened because the new poverty line was higher and included and wider range of essential expenditures. The committee argued that poverty measurement should not only focus on minimum calorie requirements but should also account for the changing needs of the modern society. For example, today education and healthcare are essential requirements for human development. As a family may have enough food, but if they cannot afford a medical treatment and education, so for their children, they still face a serious deprivation. The Rangarajan committee therefore attempted to provide a more realistic picture of poverty in India. Another important contribution of the committee was highlighted that the importance of the regularly updating poverty estimation methods. As the economies grow and lifestyle change, poverty measurement must also evolve. The poverty line that was appropriate decades ago may not accurately reflect present day living conditions. Although the recommendation of the Rangarajan committee generally significance decision, they were not officially adopted as the primary poverty estimation method by the government of India. However, the committee's work remained highly important because of it enriched the debate on poverty measurements and highlighted the need for more comprehensive approach. To summarize, the C. Rangarajan committee revived the Tendulkar methodology, proposed the broader conception of a basket, raised the poverty line estimates, and attempted to provide a more realistic assignment of poverty in the India. Its recommendation contributed significantly to the ongoing evolution of poverty estimated in the country. So far, we studied Tendulkar committee and the Rangarajan committee separately. Now, in this slide, let's compare the both commi- committees and understand their major differences. Both committees were formed to improve poverty estimations in India, but they adopted different approaches and methodology. Let's start with the Tendulkar committee. The Tendulkar committee was established in 2005 and submitted its recommendations in 2009. Its main objective was to make a move away from the traditional calorie based approach and develop the more realistic expenditure based method of measuring poverty. On the other hand, the Rangarajan committee was established in 2012 and submitted its reports in 2014. The purpose of this committee was to revise the poverty estimates generated by the Tendulkar methodology and determine whether they truly reflected the cost of living in India. The first major difference between the two committees is their poverty line basket. The Tendulkar committee used a consumption basket that focused on actual expenditure patterns observed in the households. In contrast, the Rangarajan committee proposed a broader consumption basket that included a larger set of food and non-food requirements. The second difference is related to the poverty line estimations. The Tendulkar committee recommended a lower poverty line. As a result, fewer people were classified as the poor. The Rangarajan committee suggested a higher poverty line base because it believed that the cost of meeting basic needs was greater than what the Tendulkar estimates indicated. Because of this higher poverty line, the Rangarajan methodology identified the larger number of living below the poverty line. The third difference related to the food and the nutritional requirement. The Tendulkar committee moved away from the explicit calorie norms and focused mainly on observed expenditure patterns. However, the Rangarajan committee paid greater attention to the nutritional requirements while also considering non-food expenditure. Another important difference is the treatment of the essential services. The Tendulkar committee included spending on education and healthcare, which was the major improvement over the earlier methods. The Rangarajan committee further expanded this approach and provided a more comprehensive estimate of the basic consumption needs. Let's understand as the practical implementation of these differences. Suppose two committees are measuring a poverty in the same village. The Tendulkar methodology may classify a certain number of families as a poor. However, because the Rangarajan poverty line is higher, additional families may also be classified as a poor under the Rangarajan approach. This does not necessarily mean poverty suddenly increased. It simply means that the standard used to measure poverty became more comprehensive. One important point is to remember that the both committees contributed significantly to poverty estimation in India. The Tendulkar committee modernized the methodology and shifted attention beyond calorie consumption. The Rangarajan committee further refined the approach by proposing a broader and more realistic consumption basket. Rather than seeing them as a competing approaches, we can view them as a successive implementations in India's understanding of poverty. As a policymakers and economists gain better data and deeper insights, poverty measurement continues to evolve. Therefore, both committees played an important role in making poverty estimation more accurate and relevant to the contemporary economic conditions. The key takeaway from this slide is that Tendulkar committee introduced a modern expenditure-based approach, while the Rangarajan committee expanded and refined it by recommending a higher and more comprehensive poverty line. As far now we reached the final slide of this presentation. We discovered where the poverty elimination has been major goal for the Indian development strategies. And in this slide, we are going to be discuss what are the programs and the government initiatives that has been taken to control poverty. Okay, the programs of the initiatives are Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, MG Narega Act launched in 2005, Ministry of the Rural Development to provide livelihood security by the guaranteeing 100 days of the wage employment to the financial year. Key features and components with the legal rights to work, demand and driven wages payment within the 15 days. The targeted groups are rural households whose adult members volunteered for unskilled manual workers. And the second one is the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana PMGSY, launched in 2000, Ministry of the Rural Development, nodal ministry, and objective is to provide all weather road connectivity to the unconnected habitants. It features is connectivity to the villages, improves access to the markets, services, and the target is for rural areas, and goes on to the like National Rural Livelihood Mission, NRLM, Ajivika, Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana PMJDY, launched in 2014. It is the financial service and financial inclusion, and a Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana PMAY Gramin. Okay, and the National Food Security Act NFSA, and Integrated Child Development Services ICDS, National Health Mission NHM, Deen Dayal Antyodaya Yojana, National Urban Livelihood Mission DAYNLM, Atal Pension Yojana APY, launched in 2015. Okay, to provide the pension of the unorganized sector workers. And the other important initiatives are Skill India Mission, Skill Development and Employment, Stand Up India, Credit Support to the SC and ST women entrepreneurs, Startup India, PM Mudra Yojana, Swachh Bharat Mission. Impact of the poverty are increases in the rural wages and employment services, financial inclusion, employments of the women through the SHGs, better access to the food, health, education, housing, and reduction in the vulnerability and promotion to the inclusive growth. And the challenges are inadequate coverages and targeting errors, leakages and implementation and corruption, low awareness and capacity constraints, inadequate convergences among the programs, need for better monitoring, evaluation, and accountability. To fight against the poverty requires the combined efforts from the government, private sectors, and society as a whole. With a better education, employment, opportunities, healthcare access, and a sustainable economic development, poverty can be reduced significantly in the future. Right? Thank you for everyone for your time and attention. I am Parashuram, and this concludes my presentation on poverty in India. Thank you. If you need a PDF of this, you can ask in the comment section. I will provide it. Thank you.